The early morning sun cast long shadows across the private terminal of Atlanta International Airport as Dr. Michelle Richardson pulled up in her sleek black Mercedes. The clock on her dashboard read 6:45 a.m., exactly 1 hour before her scheduled flight to Boston, where she was set to deliver a keynote speech at a prestigious medical conference. At 42 years old, Dr. Richardson had built a reputation as one of the country's leading neurosurgeons. Her skilled hands had saved countless lives, and her groundbreaking research had changed how doctors approach complex brain surgeries. Yet, despite her achievements, she remained surprisingly down to earth, preferring to let her work speak for itself. As she stepped out of her car, the cool morning air brushed against her face. She wore a perfectly tailored navy blue pantsuit that spoke of quiet confidence rather than flashy wealth. Her natural hair was styled in elegant twists, and a simple pearl necklace, a graduation gift from her late mother, adorned her neck. The terminal's valet approached with a warm smile, having served Dr. Richardson on several previous occasions. "Good morning, Dr. Richardson. Another early flight." James, the elderly valet, greeted her cheerfully as he took her car keys. "Yes, James. Boston this time," she replied with a genuine smile. "How's your granddaughter doing in college?" James beamed at her thoughtfulness. "She's loving it, Doc. That advice you gave her about medical school applications really helped. She's already planning for her MCAT next year." Dr. Richardson gathered her laptop bag and pulled her small carry-on luggage from the trunk. "Tell her to email me if she needs any guidance. We need more passionate young people in medicine." The glass doors of the private terminal slid open silently as she approached. The interior was a study in luxury, with plush leather seats and modern art adorning the walls. A few other early morning travelers sat scattered throughout the waiting area, most absorbed in their phones or laptops. Sarah, the usual receptionist, wasn't at her post this morning. Instead, an unfamiliar security guard stood at the check-in counter, his expression stern and unwelcoming. Dr. Richardson noticed his name tag read Thomas Wells as she approached with her documentation ready. The terminal's atmosphere seemed to shift subtly. A few regular travelers who recognized her looked up with friendly nods, but something felt different this morning. Dr. Richardson had experienced enough situations in her life to recognize the slight tension in the air, but she maintained her professional demeanor as she approached the counter. She placed her ID, pilot program membership card, and flight documentation on the counter. "Good morning. I'm Dr. Richardson, checking in for the 7:45 flight to Boston." Wells barely glanced at her documents before his eyes narrowed suspiciously. "This is a private terminal, ma'am. Are you sure you're in the right place?" The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Dr. Richardson had heard this tone before, the subtle emphasis on private, the deliberate use of ma'am instead of doctor, despite her credentials lying right there on the counter. She took a slow, careful breath, just as she did before beginning a difficult surgery. "Yes, I'm quite sure," she replied evenly, sliding her platinum membership card forward. "I've been a member of this private aviation program for the past 5 years." Wells picked up her ID with exaggerated scrutiny, holding it up to the light as if checking for counterfeiting. By now, several other travelers had stopped what they were doing to watch the scene unfold. Dr. Richardson could feel their eyes on her, but she maintained her composure, standing straight and calm. "We've had some issues with fraudulent documentation lately," Wells said, his tone suggesting he'd already made up his mind about her. "I'll need to see additional identification and proof of your flight booking." Dr. Richardson opened her laptop bag and retrieved her medical license and hospital ID badge. As she did so, her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Sarah Chen, her colleague in Boston. "Can't wait for your presentation on the new minimally invasive technique. The whole department is excited to learn from you." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. In just a few hours, she was supposed to be teaching a room full of eager medical professionals about life-saving procedures, yet here she was, being forced to prove her right to exist in this space. But Dr. Richardson had learned long ago that grace under pressure wasn't just useful in the operating room. It was essential in every aspect of life. Little did she know, this morning would test that grace in ways she hadn't experienced in years, and her response would leave an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. Wells stared at the growing pile of identification documents on his counter, yet his frown only deepened. Behind Dr. Richardson, a line was beginning to form, but the security guard seemed determined to drag out this inspection. He picked up her hospital ID badge, squinting at it as if trying to find flaws. Chief of Neurosurgery. His voice carried a note of disbelief that made several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. At Boston General? Yes, Dr. Richardson replied calmly, though she noticed her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her phone. Would you like to see my medical license again, or perhaps my board certification? A well-dressed businessman standing in line behind her cleared his throat impatiently. Come on, man, some of us have flights to catch. But Wells ignored him, his attention fixed solely on Dr. Richardson. You understand we have to be thorough, Wells said, his tone suggesting he was doing everyone a favor. We can't just let anyone walk in here claiming to be a doctor. He emphasized the word doctor in a way that made its meaning clear to everyone within earshot. Dr. Richardson took another steady breath, remembering the words her father had taught her years ago. Your dignity is not determined by their ignorance. She stood straighter, her voice remaining professional but firm. Mr. Wells, she said, noting how his eyebrows rose at her use of his name, I provided 6 forms of identification, including my private aviation membership card, pilot program documentation, and medical credentials. Is there something specific you're looking for? Just then, a young white woman in a tennis outfit breezed through the door, chatting loudly on her phone. Wells barely glanced at her ID before waving her through with a friendly smile. The contrast was so stark that several passengers exchanged knowing looks. I'll need to verify these with my supervisor, Wells announced, gathering up Dr. Richardson's documents. Please step aside and wait. That won't be necessary, a new voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see James, the valet, standing there with another security guard, an older man with gray hair and a kind face. Hey, Mark. Can you help out here? Dr. Richardson is running late for her flight, and she's one of our regular members. Mark stepped forward, recognition lighting up his face. Dr. Richardson, I'm so sorry about this. My sister was one of your patients last year, that tumor removal you did. She's doing great now, thanks to you. The atmosphere in the terminal shifted instantly. Wells's face flushed red as Mark quickly began processing Dr. Richardson's check-in, treating her with the respect her position and humanity deserved. But the damage was already done. The humiliation of being forced to prove herself in front of an audience had left its mark. A young black girl, probably around 12, sat with her parents nearby, watching the scene unfold. Dr. Richardson caught her eye and saw both worry and recognition in the child's face. It was a look she knew well, the early realization that the world might treat you differently because of your skin color. Instead of rushing through now that Mark had taken over, Dr. Richardson turned slightly toward the young girl and smiled warmly. She wanted this child to see not just the injustice, but also how to handle it with grace and dignity. Thank you, Mark, Dr. Richardson said clearly, making sure her voice carried. And thank you, Mr. Wells, for being so thorough in your security duties. The sarcasm was subtle but unmistakable, though in the future, you might want to apply such thoroughness equally to all passengers. Wells stood frozen, his face growing even redder as Mark efficiently processed Dr. Richardson's documents and handed them back to her. Several passengers nodded in approval at her composed response, while others looked ashamed for not speaking up sooner. As she gathered her belongings, Dr. Richardson noticed the young girl had pulled out a notebook and was writing something. The girl's mother leaned over and whispered something that made her daughter smile proudly. Sometimes, Dr. Richardson realized the most important surgeries weren't the ones performed in an operating room, but the ones that helped heal society's deeper wounds. She walked toward the private terminal's security checkpoint, her heels clicking confidently on the marble floor. The morning sun now streamed fully through the windows, and she held her head high as she walked through its warm light. Behind her, she could hear Mark quietly but firmly explaining proper security protocols to Wells. The day was just beginning, and already it had become about something much bigger than a simple flight to Boston. Just as Dr. Richardson approached the security checkpoint, Wells's voice rang out again, louder this time. Hold on, we're not done here. He hurried from behind his counter, waving a piece of paper in his hand. Mark, the senior security guard, stepped forward with concern. Thomas, I've already cleared her credentials. Everything's in order. But Wells wasn't backing down. His face was red with what looked like a mix of embarrassment and determination. Protocol states we need to verify any unusual circumstances. A private jet booking this last minute needs extra screening. Dr. Richardson turned around slowly, aware that every eye in the terminal was on her again. The young girl with the notebook was now recording something in her phone, while her parents watched with growing anger. Last-minute booking? Dr. Richardson reached into her laptop bag and pulled out her flight itinerary. This flight was booked 3 months ago. I'm a guest speaker at the International Neurosurgery Conference. Her voice remained steady, though her hand tightened slightly on the strap of her bag. A woman in a business suit stood up from her seat. This is ridiculous. I've seen Dr. Richardson here at least a dozen times. She operated on my husband last year. Wells's face twisted into something ugly. Well, if you're really such a famous doctor, why haven't I heard of you? For all we know, these could be fake documents. There's been a rise in security breaches lately. The tension in the terminal reached a breaking point. The young girl's father started to rise from his seat, but his daughter grabbed his arm, pointing at Dr. Richardson with admiration in her eyes. She wanted to see how the doctor would handle this. Just then, the terminal doors opened, and Captain David Chen walked in, his pilot's uniform crisp and neat. He stopped short at the scene before him, his eyes widening in recognition. Dr. Richardson, he called out, striding forward. I was just coming to check if you'd arrived. We need to leave soon to make your keynote speech time. Wells turned to the pilot, his expression suspicious. You know this woman? Captain Chen's friendly smile faded. Know her? Dr. Richardson saved my daughter's life 2 years ago. She removed a brain tumor that 3 other surgeons said was inoperable. He turned to Dr. Richardson with respect. Sarah's starting college this fall, doctor. Pre-med, actually. You inspired her. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Wells took a small step backward, but his stubbornness hadn't fully deflated. Still, procedures need to be followed. Security isn't a joke. No, it isn't, Dr. Richardson agreed, surprising everyone with her calm tone. She walked back to where Wells stood and placed her conference badge on the counter. Security is about protecting people, Mr. Wells. All people. But what you're doing right now isn't about security, is it? The terminal had gone completely quiet. Even the usual airport announcements seemed muted. The young girl was still recording, her phone steady in her hands. You've checked my ID multiple times. You've verified my flight details. You've had 2 people vouch for my identity, including your superior. Dr. Richardson's voice was clear and measured. So let's be honest about what's really happening here. Wells shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence crumbling under her steady gaze. I'm just doing my job, he muttered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Your job is to ensure the safety of all passengers, not to harass select ones based on your personal biases. Dr. Richardson's words carried no anger, only a firm truth that seemed to fill the entire terminal. Every minute you spend questioning my right to be here is a minute taken away from actual security concerns. Captain Chen stepped forward. Dr. Richardson, we should head to the aircraft. The weather report shows some turbulence ahead, and I'd like to get you to Boston with time to prepare for your speech. Dr. Richardson nodded, then turned back to Wells one last time. The security guard was now staring at the floor, his earlier bravado completely deflated. The young girl had stopped recording and was furiously typing on her phone, probably sharing what she'd witnessed with her friends. Mr. Wells, Dr. Richardson said softly, I hope this experience teaches you something valuable, because tomorrow there might be someone else's daughter or mother or sister standing here, and they deserve better than this. We all do. With those words, she turned and followed Captain Chen toward the security checkpoint. Behind her, Mark was already on the phone with what sounded like the terminal management, his voice low but firm. The morning sun had fully risen now, streaming through the windows and illuminating the path ahead, as if nature itself was pointing the way forward. As Dr. Richardson walked through the security checkpoint alongside Captain Chen, a commotion erupted behind them. Linda Martinez, the terminal manager, had arrived, her heels clicking rapidly across the marble floor as she approached Wells. What is going on here? Linda's voice was sharp with concern. I just got 3 calls about a disruption involving one of our most respected members. Wells stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without words. The young girl who had been recording everything walked up to Linda, her phone extended. I have it all on video, ma'am. Everything he did. Dr. Richardson paused, turning back to face the scene. She could have kept walking, could have left Wells to face the consequences of his actions alone, but something made her stay, perhaps the same instinct that had led her to become a doctor in the first place, the desire to heal more than just physical wounds. Ms. Martinez, Dr. Richardson called out softly. May I have a word? The terminal manager hurried over, her face full of concern. Dr. Richardson, I am so sorry about this incident. I assure you, appropriate action will be taken. Actually, Dr. Richardson said, glancing at Wells, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, I'd like to suggest something different. She walked back to where Wells stood, aware that everyone was watching this unexpected turn of events. Mr. Wells, she began, her voice calm but firm, would you like to know what I'm going to speak about at the conference today? The question caught him off guard. He looked up, confusion clear on his face. What? I'm presenting a new surgical technique that could help patients with brain injuries recover faster. But do you know why I developed it? She paused, making sure she had his full attention. Because 10 years ago, a young black man was brought into my emergency room with a severe head trauma. He'd been assaulted by someone who thought he didn't belong in their neighborhood. The terminal had gone completely silent. Even the usual airport sounds seemed muted. That young man was a medical student. He survived, thank God, but his dreams of becoming a surgeon were destroyed because of someone's prejudice. Dr. Richardson's voice carried no anger, only a deep sadness. Every time someone like you decides who belongs and who doesn't, you're not just creating an unpleasant moment. You're potentially destroying dreams, futures, lives. Wells's face had lost all its previous arrogance. He looked small now, almost childlike in his shame. The young girl who had been recording everything had tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. I don't want you to lose your job, Mr. Wells, Dr. Richardson continued, surprising everyone. I want you to learn from this. Would you be willing to do that? He nodded slowly, unable to meet her eyes. Then here's what I propose, she turned to Linda Martinez. Instead of termination, perhaps Mr. Wells could undergo comprehensive bias training. And maybe, she paused, a small smile forming on her lips, he could spend some time volunteering at Boston General's Diversity and Inclusion Program. I know they're always looking for security personnel to help with their community outreach events. Linda's eyes widened with understanding. That's very generous of you, Dr. Richardson. Sometimes, Dr. Richardson said, looking around the terminal at all the faces watching this scene unfold, the best way to fight ignorance is with education, not punishment. The young girl suddenly spoke up, her voice clear and strong. Dr. Richardson, I want to be just like you when I grow up. The doctor smiled warmly at her. Being yourself is even better. Just remember that grace doesn't mean accepting injustice. It means fighting it with dignity. Captain Chen cleared his throat gently. Doctor, we really should board now. Dr. Richardson nodded, then turned one last time to Wells. The program at Boston General starts next month. I'll have them expect you. She handed him her business card. Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest growth. It's up to you to decide what happens next. As she finally walked toward her flight, the terminal burst into applause. The young girl was furiously typing on her phone again, probably sharing this unexpected ending with her followers. Wells stood holding the business card like it was made of gold, his eyes showing the first glimmer of understanding. Sometimes, the hardest hearts could be opened not by force, but by an unexpected act of grace. Dr. Richardson had not only handled the situation with dignity, she had turned it into an opportunity for real change. Aboard the private jet, Dr. Richardson finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. As Captain Chen prepared for takeoff, she sat in the luxurious leather seat, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a glass of water. Sarah, the flight attendant, approached with concern in her eyes. Dr. Richardson, are you all right? We all heard what happened in the terminal. I'm fine, Sarah, she replied with a small smile, just processing everything. She pulled out her phone and saw it was flooded with messages. The young girl's video had already started making rounds on social media. You handled that situation beautifully, Sarah said, setting down a fresh cup of tea. Most people wouldn't have shown such compassion. Dr. Richardson stared out the window at the morning sky. You know, my father taught me something valuable when I was young. He said, Michelle, when people show you their worst, that's your chance to show them your best. The plane began taxiing down the runway, and Dr. Richardson's phone buzzed with a message from Linda Martinez. Mr. Wells just requested to speak with you after your return flight. He seems genuinely affected by what happened. As the jet took off, Dr. Richardson thought about the young girl in the terminal. She opened her laptop and began typing an email to Boston General's community outreach program. She had an idea forming, one that could turn this morning's incident into something meaningful for more than just Mr. Wells. Dr. Richardson. Captain Chen's voice came over the intercom. There's someone who'd like to speak with you once we reach cruising altitude. Remember my daughter Sarah, the one you operated on? She's actually on the phone with the tower right now. She's an air traffic controller there. Tears welled up in Dr. Richardson's eyes. 2 years ago, she had spent 14 hours in surgery, refusing to give up on Captain Chen's daughter when other doctors said the tumor was inoperable. Now that same girl was helping guide planes safely through the sky. The jet leveled off, and Captain Chen patched Sarah's voice through. Dr. Richardson, I just wanted to say thank you again, not just for saving my life, but for showing everyone today what real strength looks like. Dr. Richardson picked up the cabin phone, her voice warm. Sarah, honey, you're the one showing real strength. Your father tells me you're at the top of your class. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied proudly. And I'm also running a support group for young women entering male-dominated fields. What you did today, that's exactly what we talk about in our meetings. As they chatted, Dr. Richardson's mind went back to the young girl in the terminal. She opened her laptop again and added to her email. We need to create a mentorship program for young people who face discrimination. Let them see successful professionals who look like them. The flight attendant brought her breakfast, but Dr. Richardson was too energized to eat. She was already outlining a new initiative, one that would bring together medical professionals, airport staff, and community leaders to address systemic bias through education and personal connection. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from the young girl's mother. My daughter Jasmine hasn't stopped talking about you. She's already changed her career choice from artist to doctor. Would you consider being her mentor? Dr. Richardson smiled, remembering herself at Jasmine's age, full of dreams but unsure if the world would let her achieve them. She typed a quick reply. I'd be honored. Tell her art and medicine aren't mutually exclusive. Some of the best surgeons I know are also artists. Looking out at the clouds below, Dr. Richardson realized that sometimes life's most difficult moments could become catalysts for change. What started as an ugly incident of discrimination had transformed into an opportunity to create something positive. Sarah, the flight attendant, returned with fresh tea. We'll be landing in Boston in about an hour, Doctor. Will you be okay presenting at the conference after all this? Dr. Richardson straightened in her seat, a determined smile on her face. Actually, I think I'm going to modify my presentation a bit. Along with discussing the new surgical technique, I want to talk about breaking barriers in medicine, because sometimes the most important things we heal aren't just bodies, they're minds and hearts too. As the plane cruised through the morning sky, Dr. Richardson began revising her presentation. Today's speech would be about more than just medical procedures. It would be about transformation, about turning prejudice into progress, about the power of responding to hatred with grace. The conference hall at Boston Medical Center was packed with medical professionals from around the world. Dr. Richardson stood backstage, making final adjustments to her presentation slides. The morning's events at the airport felt like a lifetime ago, yet they had completely transformed the speech she was about to give. 5 minutes, Dr. Richardson, a young event coordinator, informed her, clearly starstruck. The audience is twice what we expected. Word got out about what happened this morning. Dr. Richardson checked her phone one last time. Jasmine's video had gone viral, with millions of views and thousands of supportive comments. But what caught her attention was a message from Mark, the security guard at Atlanta's terminal. Mr. Wells has been sitting in the break room watching your old speeches on YouTube. He hasn't said much, but I can see he's thinking hard about everything. The conference hall lights dimmed, and Dr. Richardson heard the introduction begin. Our keynote speaker today is not just one of the world's leading neurosurgeons. This morning, she showed us that true healing goes beyond the operating room. As she walked onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. Dr. Richardson saw hundreds of faces looking back at her, including many young medical students of color who had somehow managed to get last-minute seats. Their eyes shone with pride and hope. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I was going to start by discussing our new minimally invasive technique for treating brain tumors. And we'll get to that." She paused, looking around the room. "But first, I want to talk about a different kind of surgery, the kind we need to perform on our society's prejudices." The room went completely silent. In the front row, she noticed several hospital board members leaning forward, intrigued by this unexpected opening. "This morning, I experienced something that many of us have faced before: judgment based on appearance rather than ability." She shared the story, not with anger or bitterness, but as a case study in human behavior. But what struck me most wasn't the discrimination itself. It was how many people in that terminal wanted to help but didn't know how. Dr. Richardson clicked to her first slide, not the brain scan she'd originally planned, but a quote from her father. "Healing happens when we turn moments of pain into opportunities for growth. In medicine, we don't just treat symptoms," she continued. "We look for root causes. And today, I realized that the same approach could help us address discrimination." She outlined her new initiative for the mentorship program, watching as people in the audience began taking rapid notes. "The young man I told you about earlier, the medical student who lost his dream of becoming a surgeon. His name was Marcus Thompson, and while I couldn't save his career, his story inspired me to develop the technique I'm presenting today." She clicked to the next slide, showing the complex surgical procedure. "We called it the Thompson Method in his honor." The presentation flowed seamlessly between medical innovation and social change. Dr. Richardson explained how the same precision and care needed for brain surgery should be applied to addressing societal biases. She shared her vision for the mentorship program, watching as more and more hands raised to volunteer. "And this morning taught me something else," she said, nearing the end of her speech. "Sometimes, the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger, it's excellence combined with grace. Every time we respond to hatred with dignity, we perform a kind of surgery on society's consciousness." The room erupted in a standing ovation. In the back, several medical students were wiping tears from their eyes. The hospital board members were already huddled together, discussing how to implement her mentorship program ideas. Dr. Richardson's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was another message from Linda Martinez. "Mr. Wells just signed up for every available diversity training session. He asked if he could share his story with other security personnel as a teaching tool. You've started something powerful here, Doctor." As the applause continued, Dr. Richardson thought about Jasmine, the young girl from the terminal, and Sarah Chen, the air traffic controller. She thought about Marcus Thompson, whose tragedy had led to medical breakthrough. She thought about Mr. Wells, now beginning his own journey of transformation. "Questions?" she asked the audience with a warm smile. Hundreds of hands shot up, and Dr. Richardson knew that today's presentation had done more than just teach a new surgical technique. It had planted seeds of change that would grow far beyond this conference hall. 3 days later, Dr. Richardson's return flight to Atlanta was very different from her departure. As her car pulled up to the private terminal, she noticed several changes. New signs about respect and inclusion had been posted, and the security staff wore fresh diversity training completion pins on their uniforms. Linda Martinez was waiting at the entrance. "Dr. Richardson, you've started a movement. 5 other airports have already contacted us about implementing similar training programs." Inside the terminal, the atmosphere had completely changed. The same morning sunlight streamed through the windows, but now it fell on walls decorated with photographs of diverse aviation pioneers and medical professionals who had broken barriers in their fields. As she approached the security desk, Dr. Richardson stopped short. Thomas Wells was there, but he looked different. The arrogance was gone from his posture, replaced by a quiet humility. When he saw her, he straightened up nervously. "Dr. Richardson," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been hoping you'd let me speak with you." She nodded, setting down her bag. The terminal wasn't as busy as it had been 3 days ago, but the few passengers present watched with interest, some recognizing her from the viral video. "These past few days," Wells began, "I've done a lot of thinking. I've watched your speeches, read about your work. He paused, struggling to find the right words. I've also been reading about Marcus Thompson, the medical student you mentioned in your conference speech. Dr. Richardson's eyes softened. You watched the conference video? Yes, ma'am. Doctor, he corrected himself quickly. I watched it 3 times, and he reached under the counter and pulled out a folder. I've already signed up for the Boston General program you mentioned, but I wanted to show you something else. He opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. It showed a younger version of himself standing next to a black man in medical scrubs. This is my brother-in-law, James. He's a nurse at Grady Memorial. When all this happened, I called him, told him what I'd done. Wells's voice cracked slightly. He's been trying to tell me for years about the things he faces, but I never really listened, never wanted to see it. Dr. Richardson took in the photo, noting the genuine smiles on both men's faces. Sometimes it's hardest to see our own biases when they affect people close to us. James and I used to be close, Wells continued, but we drifted apart these past few years. After what happened with you, I finally understood why. He straightened his new diversity training pin. I've asked him to help me learn, to really understand. He's agreed to come to some of the training sessions with me. Just then, a familiar face appeared. Jasmine, the young girl from 3 days ago, walked in with her parents. Her face lit up when she saw Dr. Richardson. Dr. Richardson. Look, she held up a thick medical book. My parents got me this after watching your speech. Did you know that Dr. Daniel Hale Williams performed one of the first successful open-heart surgeries? He looked like me. Dr. Richardson smiled warmly. You certainly did. And one day, people might be reading about Dr. Jasmine's groundbreaking surgeries too. Wells watched this interaction with visible emotion. Dr. Richardson, he said quietly, would it be okay if I told Jasmine about the mentorship program you're starting? My brother-in-law knows some other medical professionals who might want to get involved. The transformation in Wells was remarkable. Where there had been defensive anger, there was now an eagerness to help. Dr. Richardson saw in his eyes the same spark she'd seen countless times in her career, the moment when someone realizes they can be part of positive change. Actually, she said, why don't you tell her yourself? Jasmine, Mr. Wells here has something exciting to share with you about becoming a doctor. As Wells began explaining the program to an excited Jasmine, Dr. Richardson checked her phone. There was a message from the conference organizers. Her speech had been viewed online over 2 million times. Hospitals across the country were reaching out about implementing similar initiatives. Linda Martinez appeared at her side. Your flight is ready, doctor. But I thought you'd like to know, that security training program you suggested. We're making it mandatory for all airport staff nationwide. Sometimes it takes one moment of grace to change everything. Dr. Richardson looked around the terminal one last time. In just 3 days, a place that had been the site of discrimination had transformed into a space of learning and growth. As she walked toward her gate, she heard Wells telling Jasmine, I'm learning that the best security comes from understanding and respecting each other. 1 month later, Dr. Richardson stood in the main auditorium of Boston General Hospital, looking out at a sea of faces. The mentorship program's inaugural event had drawn hundreds of participants, far more than anyone had expected. In the front row sat Jasmine, now wearing a white coat that matched her bright smile. Welcome, everyone, Dr. Richardson began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. A month ago, an incident of discrimination became a catalyst for change. Today, we're turning that moment into a movement. Among the audience members was Thomas Wells, sitting next to his brother-in-law James. Both men wore volunteer badges for the program. Wells had completed his diversity training and had become one of its most passionate advocates, sharing his story of transformation with other security personnel across the country. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures, Dr. Richardson continued. Sometimes it comes from small moments of grace, from choosing to respond to prejudice with dignity rather than anger. She gestured to the side of the stage, where photos of various medical pioneers lined the walls. And sometimes it comes from seeing someone who looks like you succeeding in spaces where others said you didn't belong. Jasmine stood up, walking confidently to the podium. Over the past month, she had become the face of the program's youth initiative, her viral video having inspired thousands of young people to pursue their dreams despite obstacles. My name is Jasmine Taylor, she announced, her voice clear and strong. A month ago, I watched Dr. Richardson face discrimination with incredible grace. Today, I want to share how that moment changed my life. As Jasmine spoke, Dr. Richardson noticed Captain Chen and his daughter Sarah in the audience. Sarah had taken time off from her air traffic controller duties to mentor young women interested in aviation. Next to them sat Marcus Thompson's family. They had traveled from Chicago after learning that the surgical technique named in his honor had saved its 100th patient. Wells raised his hand during the question and answer session. Dr. Richardson, could you tell everyone what you told me that day at the airport? About how security isn't just about protecting spaces, but about protecting people's dreams? Dr. Richardson smiled, remembering their confrontation that had now become a teaching moment. Security, like medicine, is about caring for people. When we let our biases control our actions, we're not protecting anyone, we're causing harm. But when we learn to see each person's humanity, we create truly safe spaces for everyone. The program had already shown remarkable results. 17 hospitals had adopted similar initiatives, and airports across the country had implemented the new training protocols. But more importantly, individual stories of change were emerging every day. Linda Martinez stood up to share the latest statistics. Since implementing these changes, customer satisfaction at our terminal has increased by 40%. But the real success isn't in the numbers, it's in the stories. Last week, a young black girl flew for the first time. When she saw our diverse security team, she told her mother, "Look, they have people who look like me keeping us safe." At the end of the event, Jasmine approached Dr. Richardson with tears in her eyes. "I got accepted into the summer medical program," she announced. "And Mr. Wells is going to help arrange tours of different hospital departments through his brother-in-law." Wells, who had overheard, smiled sheepishly. "It's the least I can do. You know, Dr. Richardson, when you offered me a chance to learn instead of punishing me, you did more than save my job. You showed me how to be a better person." As the auditorium slowly emptied, Dr. Richardson watched Wells and Jasmine discussing her upcoming hospital tours. She saw Sarah Chen mentoring the group of young women interested in aviation. She saw Marcus Thompson's mother hugging patients who had been saved by her son's legacy. Her phone buzzed with a message from the hospital board. They wanted to expand the program nationally. Another message followed from a major medical journal. They wanted to feature the initiative in their next issue. But what truly moved her was the sight of Jasmine putting on her white coat, standing tall and proud. The young girl caught her eye and smiled, then turned to help another child try on a toy stethoscope. Dr. Richardson thought back to that morning at the airport. One moment of grace had created ripples that were still spreading, touching lives in ways she never could have imagined. As she watched the next generation of dreamers finding their path, she remembered her father's words about showing your best when others show their worst. Sometimes, the greatest healing happened not in operating rooms, but in moments when people chose to respond to hatred with grace, to meet bias with understanding, and to turn obstacles into opportunities for change.